African history, legitimate trade in West Africa in the 19th C. Legitimate trade in West Africa in the 19th C. This was the greatest effect of the abolition of slave trade. Legitimate trade can be defined as a legal trade which was established after the abolition of slave trade. It dealt with material products like agricultural raw materials/crops as cocoa, rubber, coffee, cotton, cheese/nuts, palm oil, coconuts, mineral raw materials like copper, gold, other raw materials like ivory, etc., and not human beings. Slave trade can be defined as the actual buying and selling of human beings, while slavery is the absolute possession of human beings by another. The campaign against slave trade was started by Britain in 1807, and by 1833 it had been abolished because of economic conditions in Europe at the time, as well as the activities of humanitarians like William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and Henry Thornton, to mention only a few. In West Africa up to 1850, both slave trade and legitimate trade coexisted. Like palm oil was continuously exported by Calabar people, while slaves were exported from Niger Delta. By the 1860s, with the increase in mechanization in Europe, the demand for slaves had to drop drastically. The major exports of legitimate trade in West Africa were palm oil from Calabar and Niger Delta/palm kernels and palm wood from Sierra Leone, ground nuts from Senegambia, gold and ivory from Gold Coast and Ivory Coast respectively, while beeswax and ostrich feathers from Gambia and Cameroon. Imports to West Africa included textiles, guns, gunpowder, spirits, whisks, tobacco, bees, glassware, etc. Aims for establishment of legitimate trade: to completely replace slave trade activities, to enhance production of raw materials to feed European manufacturing industries, establish strong European markets for their manufactured goods, compensate the businessmen who had invested in abolition of slave trade, provide work for freed slaves, i.e., enslave them on their own land in Africa in production of raw materials. Problems involved in transition from slave trade to legitimate trade in West Africa. There arose a strong opposition from European countries such as Portugal, France, whose economy still depended on African slave labor on their plantations. Besides this, such countries wanted to industrialize. Just like Britain, they used slaves before proper industrial sector could take off. The crops suggested to replace slave trade, such as rubber, cocoa, palm oil, could not grow in some places of West Africa. Palm oil, coconuts needed a long time to mature than the British expected. Therefore, items for trade were in short supply at the start. The emergency of financial problems which came about as a result of paying for transport of available goods, unlike before when slaves transported themselves to the coast from the interior. There was also no immediate African history, legitimate trade in West Africa in the 19th CE. Source of income from legitimate trade, as these crops took long to mature. There was also lack of funds to compensate the slave traders for losing their most important source of income. Differences in religion and culture. There was no correspondence in religion. Supporters of anti-slavery were mostly Christians, yet West Africa was predominantly Muslim region, at least by the second half of the 19th century. They therefore hated slave trade abolitionists, as they considered them infidels. Social problems in Europe were worse than those in Africa, like there was social evils such as prostitution, underemployment of workers, child labor, etc. Many Africans argued that Britain and all other slave trade abolitionists should solve their problems in Europe first before intervening in slave trade activities in Africa, which made the exercise quite difficult. The number of anti-slavery manpower was small compared to a big area they were controlling along the Atlantic Ocean on the West African coastline. Therefore, this patrol group was often dodged by the slave traders, making the whole exercise difficult in West Africa. In some West African societies, such as Dahomey, slaves were acceptable by customs and culture. It was part of their ways of life. Such societies had to forcefully continue with slave trade despite the fact that measures were put in place by the abolitionists in West Africa. The anti-slavery patrol concentrated at the coast for a long time. The British and other abolitionists had concentrated at the coast of West Africa, leaving the interior unattended to. Therefore, slavery had to continue inland. This was made worse by Britain, which had no practical punishment put in place for those who insisted on slavery activities. Slave trade dealers also developed dodging tactics, like they hoisted the American flag on their slave trade vessels, which made abolitionists to ignore them, thinking that they were Americans who had got their independence from Britain and were not involved in slave trade activities. Slave trade in West Africa was partly organized by top political officers such as kings and chiefs. This made it difficult to stop it. Moreover, slave trade was a means through which rulers would get rid of criminals from their societies, like Chief George of Opobo sold some of his subjects into slavery. Some slaves had gotten used to the life of slavery. They were not sure of making a living as free people. They were unskilled to be resettled in an independent life. They were therefore unwilling to break away from slavery, in that when the campaign started, many slaves went to hide away in European suburbs, fearing to be brought back to Africa. Nevertheless, the transition to legitimate trade came with its problems of enslaving Africans on their own land, cultivating cash crops which they needed as raw materials in their industries in Europe. These crops were bought cheaply or exchanged with valuable European products like mirrors, glasses, used clothes, etc., which made Africans ask themselves lamenting questions such as, To what extent was legitimate trade legitimate? Effects of legitimate trade in West Africa. The first and most important was that instead of being a commodity, the African became a human being again with material and spiritual needs to be satisfied. However, this was followed by colonization that took away social, political, and economic independence of these African societies. There was emergence of two classes of Africans following the increased commercial activities in Africa, like African history, legitimate trade in West Africa in the 19th C. Traders like missionaries also constantly appealed for home government protection to establish peace in order to beat down the opposition of African middlemen. It was in response to such appeals that West Africa was occupied by the Europeans in the 19th century. Urbanization effect. Following the growth of legitimate trade, many new trading posts and stations in the interior were established to accommodate the activities of legitimate traders. Those later grew into bigger towns like Onitsha and Lokoja towns became famous in West Africa as a result of legitimate trade activities. They enhanced the importation of European products and articles which changed the African way of life, like dressing, eating, housing, etc. On the other hand, killed the development of African art and craft as once observed by Momu Mandin that an African entered colonization with a hoe he made himself and came out with an imported one. It led to introduction of new economic systems in West Africa, like West African economy became monetized with introduction of new currencies, bark system, credit facilitation. This broke away the traditional use of barter system. Due to the need of transporting goods inland and collecting raw materials, there were infrastructural developments. A number of railway lines connecting West Africa and the interior to the coast, like a railway from Lagos reached Kano in 1911 in Nigeria. Ghana Gold Coast, a railway line was established connecting Accra with Sekondi and Tarkwa in 1901 purposely for gold collection. In absence of such railway system, seasonal feeder roads were established in resourceful areas of West Africa. New cash crops unknown before were introduced in West Africa to supplement the main raw materials needed by European powers in the era of Industrial Revolution. It made West African chiefs and subjects to change their living habits, like slavery could no longer provide the principal source of livelihood but instead changed to cash crops and minerals.